Several decades ago, companies took on globalization as the way to do business. Countries reached across geographic chasms to form new mutually beneficial partnerships. In the wake of climate and energy issues, political instability, and wars, will a return to regionalization replace globalization? Are we looking at life after globalization? In today's world, what are the risks and benefits of regionalization and globalization? Which solutions make the most sense? My guest today is a global supply chain expert who will share his observations on our global business landscape. Let me tell you about Patrick Daly. Patrick Daly is the managing director of Alba Consulting based in Dublin, Ireland. He works with top Fortune 500 companies in manufacturing, distribution, and logistics services in Europe, Asia, and the Americas to achieve dramatic improvements in their supply chain capabilities and performance through supply chain excellence. Patrick works with clients all over the world, to include China, India, Uruguay, Puerto Rico, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, the United States, the UK, Spain, Croatia, and others. His clients include Pfizer, Abbott Vascular, Stryker, Braun, GSK, Merck Millipore, Octavis, Astellas, Pepsi Worldwide Flavors, Glanbia, Ornua, and others. The host of Interlinks, a weekly radio program broadcast on Dublin South FM, and the YouTube short video series For the Week That's in It, Patrick explores international business, supply chain, and logistics around the world. Patrick is also the author of the book, International Supply Chain Relationships, Creating Competitive Advantage in a Globalized Economy, and the booklet, Warehouse Strategy, Design, and Operation, and co-author of the recently published ebook, Thriving in the New Business Environment, Why the Strategic Supply Chain Matters. Educated with a Bachelor of Science honors degree in technology, prior to establishing his consultancy business, Patrick worked in manufacturing, engineering design, R&D, product development, and international commercial technical roles in both Spain and Ireland. Patrick, welcome to the Voice of Leadership and to Dr. Karen Speaks Leadership.
Thank you, Dr. Karen. Delighted to be here.
I'm delighted to have you here as well, and I know that you bring a much-needed global perspective. And just to make sure that everyone in the audience understands what we're talking about, I want you to first, Patrick, tell us, what is the supply chain? What does supply chain mean? What is it? And how does it affect people and businesses?
Well, the supply chain really is a misnomer because it's not a chain at all, really. It's a network. It's a web of connections and nodes, and it's global. And it's important because everything that we've become accustomed to in our day-to-day lives, the products and services that we enjoy, are dependent on the supply chain. And a lot of this remained hidden from view for many, many years, for decades. But in recent years, with a series of crises and emergencies that we can maybe talk about in some detail later, people have become acutely aware of the supply chain and its vulnerabilities. When products and services that we're used to having turn up on our doorstep without interruption suddenly don't turn up, we want to know why. And the reason often is because of events very far away in distance and time that are having effect on our experience day to day. And in the same way as consumers, we experience that, corporations experience that in terms of carrying on their business.
Thank you for just explaining the basics. The bottom line is, while we're waiting for those packages from Amazon or wherever, somebody somewhere has had to ship them, then receive them, and then transport them to us so that we get them in our doorways. And that's everything. Businesses, everything that businesses need and also that individuals need in their homes and in their offices and so on. So, in the past, Patrick, there were some benefits to moving to globalization of the supply chain or the supply network, as you're calling it. What were some of those benefits of globalization in the past?
Well, I guess there are still benefits to globalization, but we'll go back a little bit in history maybe and see what's happened, where we are, and how we got here. If we go back to the world before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and particularly if we go even back further than that, so the period, say, from the Second World War to the fall of the Berlin Wall, many companies were vertically integrated, and the great expression of that would have been the Ford Motor Company, where they owned everything from the rubber plantations to the iron ore mines to the factories and the retail outlets, and even the cleaning staff and the catering staff, and everybody was a Ford Motor Company employee. In time, companies realized that that way of exercising control of their supply network or supply chain was very expensive, and they began to divest themselves of non-core activities.
Well, I think what you're saying, Patrick, is that what started to happen is that there was a wider possibility of additional partnerships that maybe didn't exist before the Berlin Wall came down, and long time ago when transportation might have been more difficult and so on. So there were more opportunities for people to establish the global relationships. That's what I hear you saying.
That's correct. So what happened after the Berlin Wall was that companies were able to find sources of supply and markets far and wide, because the world really entered a Goldilocks period of, there was peace, there was low inflation, there was one single world power, which was the United States, and there was stability. And that enabled corporations to set up operations far and wide. And that's how we came to this world of what people termed globalization. But we need to be careful when we say globalization, in the sense that globalization was always a partial process. It was always a patchy process. There were always parts of the world that were more connected to those global networks than other parts of the world. So in terms of its advocates and its detractors, it was oversold. But that said, that is what happened. So corporations gained market, they gained competitiveness, and that was part of the process that led to the containment of inflation. So you've often heard it referred to as the Great Moderation through the 90s and the early 2000s. So what has happened since and recently is that the globalization itself facilitated the rise of many economies around the world, China most significantly, but also other medium-sized economies, the likes of Brazil, the likes of Indonesia, the likes of Turkey, and to an extent Russia, although Russia is a special case that maybe we can talk about in an aside. So the rise of the power of these countries has meant that they are exerting their own influence in their own areas, and the world has become much more fragmented. And this means that the risks have risen, the geopolitical tensions that are arising around the world are making companies reassess their global supply chain strategies. And they're beginning to realign those strategies as a function of some of these disruptions. And that's leading us to a noticeable process of regionalization. And sometimes we pose the question, is this life after globalization? And we say it that way because it's such a change. But really what we're talking about is life after globalization as we have known it. What we're really talking about is a different type of globalization, much more regionalized and much more focused on risk management, on stability and security over efficiency. And this is where we're seeing a kind of a retraction into regions. So maybe a North American region, European region, the Southeast Asian region, and so on.
Well, let me go back just a little bit. And I really appreciate that perspective where you're sort of giving us the big picture of it and what's happened over a number of years. There were benefits, and you started out by saying it was so expensive for companies to have A to Z everything that they needed in their organization.
Mm-hmm.
So they had to reach out to some partners. There were benefits to globalization in the past and also benefits today. So what were some of the past benefits? What are the benefits today of globalization?
The big obvious benefit was what would be termed maybe labor arbitrage. So labor was cheaper in countries that could undertake low-end manufacturing in the beginning. So for example, to have something made in China as opposed to having it made in Europe or in the United States, the labor rates may have been 1/10 or even smaller at that time. That's changing now. Savings in costs, access to alternative supplies, so that gave kind of a hedge against supply interruption. So having multiple sources of supply, those would be the principal advantages in the early days, and often they came with downsides that people chose to ignore and didn't fully take cognizance of at that time. And there are still many benefits, and those benefits are part of that. This is on the supply side. On the opposite side, globalization opened markets. So many American corporations that went overseas first, they had saturated in a way their home market. So we're looking for opportunities to carry out foreign direct investment, to set up factories or distribution centers in other parts of the world to access those markets. And for example, Ireland, where I am, has been a great beneficiary of that. Many American multinationals set up operations here to reach markets in Europe, in Middle East and North Africa. And that has been a phenomenon as well. So both on the supply side, there were advantages, and then also on the market side, there were advantages. Those advantages are still there, but the perspective, I think, is changing, and the emphasis is changing currently.
Yeah, let's say a little bit about what is changing in terms of perspective. If you want to still have the upside or the benefit of globalization in today's world, what does that look like? What do companies need to be thinking about? Because it's different than how it was back then, when it was more of an upside than a downside.
We're in a different game now. So as I said, these regional powers have come to the fore. They are causing instability in different parts of the world, and this is making it challenging for businesses to carry on in the same way. So where they have vulnerabilities, they need to be looking at where they are and trying to mitigate some of the risks that are involved. So for example, have been talking to a prospect, a large multinational pharmaceutical company, and they have a production plant in China where they make certain products and ingredients for other products that are used in other plants, made in China and not made anyplace else in their global network. So there's a situation that if an issue were to occur, for example, with Taiwan, some form of blockade and sanctions between the West and China, that's a key vulnerability. And in order to do something about that takes a lot of time. Like we all know, even in a building project at home, the lead time for something like that's a couple of years. To establish a new production plant, say in a friendlier location or a closer location. So if they wanted to look at Mexico, or they wanted to look at Vietnam, or they wanted to look at somewhere in the Near East, in Turkey or someplace like that, what's the lead time for doing that? I mean, it's going to take 2, 3, 4 years. So a lot of companies, I think, are a little bit behind the curve in the sense that the world has changed dramatically in the last number of years. Many companies, I think, have not necessarily been paying close attention to that, or have not been as proactive in responding to it. So this is, I think, a serious situation that we're looking at currently. And I think companies need to be paying a lot more attention to what's going on out there.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Patrick, because in the past there were maybe a few big players, so to speak, and you've been mentioning some of the smaller countries that really have a big presence, or even big countries that have a bigger presence now, such as China, in comparison to in the past. And I think that underlying what we're talking about is something you started to talk about earlier, which is this whole issue of fragmentation and the whole geopolitical landscape and what impact it has. Because if your partner doesn't share some of your values, some of the ways that you think and do business, there could be a breach later on down the line, and you don't want to be left unable to provide the resources that you need for whatever your product is. So let's talk about that bigger picture a little bit, the geopolitical landscape, this fragmentation, and what people, what companies need to be asking or thinking about as they're considering their current partnerships today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so as I mentioned, and it's curious because this kind of feeds into politics as well, and some concern in Western countries that maybe they are decadent or they are losing influence and so on. So two things are true at the same time. So the United States, in absolute terms, is more powerful militarily and economically than it has ever been, and likewise Europe. But at the same time, they're relatively less powerful as a proportion of the total power in the world. So while they have grown to maximum size, other countries, as a result of the globalization driven by the West, by America and by Europe, many powers around the world have risen to a level that now they make up a greater proportion of the world economy and world political power than they ever did before. And we see this manifest in some kind of very strange occurrences around the world. So we have a war in Europe. Russia invades Ukraine. The West imposes sanctions and expects most countries to row in with that. And then all of a sudden, some very important countries, like India, the most populous country in the world, fifth largest economy in the world, Brazil, a country with over 200 million people and a very large economy, and other powers of that size are saying, well, hang on a minute, we have a different view on this. So we're seeing powers like that. We're seeing powers like Turkey, which is a NATO member, so it's an ally of the United States and Europe, and yet they have been purchasing weapons from Russia. We see India. Prime Minister Modi was in Washington recently talking to President Biden about possible arms purchases. At the same time, they are buying cheap energy from Russia. So we're seeing all of these movements, which are quite strange to us. And the reason is because these countries now are saying, we are not necessarily going to align in one camp or another camp. So this is making for quite unpredictable conditions. There's an organization called the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and so on. And some talk of them becoming some sort of a counter bloc to the Western bloc. And that's not really going to happen either, because there's no coherence between them. So it's not so much that there's going to be a global power bloc that's going to rival the West. There's just going to be lots of moderately powerful countries that are going to be plowing their own furrow, and they're going to be making alliances here and there on different issues as suits their interests at any given time. So this is the fragmentation we're talking about. So in the context of trying to run international businesses, as we did in the Goldilocks period between 1990 and 2010, that's going to be a lot more challenging. So whereas a corporate headquarters from a supply chain global risk perspective may have been able to take the view, the world is stable, the US is the global policeman, nothing much is going to upset operations if we have a factory in China, or we have one in Taiwan, or we have one in India. But that has changed. And I think that has changed to such a degree and so fast that people have not kept up with it. And I think there's a lot of work to be done now at an accelerated pace for companies to change their approach to how they pay attention to what's going on in the world, how they assess risk, and how that knowledge and that intelligence feeds into decisions that they take about where to place their interests around the world. That's the world that we're entering now. This is life after globalization, if you like, or life after globalization as we have known it up to now.
Yeah, I would like to add something to that, Patrick, because this is quite interesting. I think that companies, what you're saying, they really need to be even more cognizant of the world political climate and situation, and about the partners they partner with and the partners their partners partner with, because these alliances may involve third and fourth parties that normally we wouldn't have to consider or contend with. People are in a position where they're doing more of what fits their personal interest, is what you're saying. And those may not align with, let's say, the interests of the United States or different countries in Europe, as an example. And that's different than how it used to be. It used to be, if you were a friend of the United States, you did not do business with those who the United States might have considered enemies. That's no longer the case. And so people can have multiple different kinds of alliances, and you have to think, several paces down the road about what are the implications of that, what might be the downside, or what could be an outcome that's unforeseen, or maybe even unprecedented. Maybe we haven't seen it before. So I'm hearing those issues as some of the risks that you're really talking about.
Yeah, and I think it's a real challenge for businesses, because those skills, those approaches, and that level of awareness is not something that comes natural to a business. This is almost like having a department of foreign affairs inside your business to understand what's going on, because not only is it difficult to predict now what will happen, it's difficult to understand in real time what is actually going on. Because, for example, we saw recently China broker a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So Saudi Arabia and Iran were arch enemies at each other's throat. China has never been seen to be a peacemaker on the international scene. That's a role that normally was the United States, or the United States with European powers. And all of a sudden we see this development, which is quite strange and quite unusual. And it's very hard to figure out what's going on. So these are the types of things that people in business need to be cognizant of. And it needs almost quite a sophisticated and nuanced understanding of the different regions where you have key interests. So it's going to need, I think, new skills, maybe even new types of people. You're going to need people like, we've spoken a lot about, English is the universal business language, and you can do business all over with English, and everybody rows in and they speak to you in English with American accents, even though they're from other parts of the world. And that's fine to a degree, but I think to get a handle on what's going to be going on in the future, you're going to need people who understand those localities, who speak languages, and who have culture and experience, so that they can understand the nuances they can help interpret what's happening at different times. And also, I think supply chain risk management as an activity, as a function, needs a strategy, and it needs to feed into the top table, and it needs to be taken seriously. So I can't kind of stress enough how important this is going to be. And if you listen to the people who know, whatever side of the political spectrum they're on. So I was listening today to an interview with John Bolton, who's the former security advisor in the Trump administration. So you can listen to him, but you can listen just as well to Hillary Clinton talking about the same stuff from her experience as Secretary of State. What's going on out there? This should be a bipartisan issue, and it should also be a common issue of interest between America and its European allies. What's going on out there is quite at the moment is quite serious, and business, I think, needs to catch up. There are a few big corporations who've had the resources and have had the insight, and they're on top of this. But most businesses, even some of the big names, are behind on this and really need to play catch up.
Yeah, that's really a good point. And I think one of the observations I would make about the American mindset in comparison to a European way of thinking about things, Americans very often don't always take a global perspective. When you think about it, our country is so large and we're over here geographically more isolated than the Europeans are, because you have multiple countries right next door to each other, close enough to be in the US perspective, like states. And so therefore, it's been much more my experience that Europeans keep up with global news and keep up with the global perspective, and they have their hand on that pulse, so to speak. And in addition, they speak more foreign languages than Americans do. And so I think that helps, because when you talk about the translation that's necessary, it's a cultural lens you have to translate through. And if you don't understand other cultures, the conclusions you come to probably are not going to be accurate. So in some respects, I think that Europe has some benefits because you've been doing that type of analysis for a long time, and you understand the importance of it because you're so close to your neighbors as opposed to the United States.
Yeah, both Europe and America have pros and cons in their approach to this. So some of the most globalized companies in the world are American, but at the same time, there's a smaller proportion of American companies as an overall that are involved in international business. There's a far greater proportion of American businesses who do no business outside America, as say compared to European countries, because it's difficult to go more than a few hundred miles in Europe before you are into a different country and a different language and different legal system and so on. So although well, not all, but 27 of us are in the European Union, even within the European Union, the legal regime and the fiscal regime varies from country to country. And then you have a whole series of countries, some that are more or less associated with the European Union, some that are not at all, and they have their own systems. So that makes Europeans, I guess, more gregarious. They do speak more languages generally, and they're more familiar with different cultural environments, just even moving around the continent. And then also we're closer to Russia, we're closer to the Middle East, and we're closer to North Africa. And many people would have visited those places. So people in Europe do travel a lot. Lots of people have passports, and they've been here, there, and everywhere. America is 330 million people. It's got two massive oceans either side of it. It's got friendly neighbors north and south, and therefore it is prone to that kind of isolationism, not so much as a political idea, but just as a geographical fact. You're in a big continent far from other places, so it can be easy to fall into the trap to believe that the outside world doesn't really affect America, but it does to a huge degree as well. And part of the issue, I think, that America is coming to terms with is that despite having such great military power and such great political power, because of the way the world is moving and how it's leveling in terms of other economic powers being strong, and the great military advantage not being such an advantage as it was before. Because look at the damage you can do with cheap drones. So, you know, America's military advantage, although it's massive, maybe is not as relevant as it was before. And therefore, the only way really to manage the global situation to America's values that align with our values in Europe is through cooperation and collaboration. The track record on that has been patchy over the last number of years. So I guess we're entering a period where we have this great stability, where our realization of what's going on hasn't really kept up, and the political discourse is maybe not taking full cognizance of the complexity and the dangers that are out there. Because it feels, sometimes it can feel like things haven't changed. It's a bit like, you know, that magic trick, the guys where they pull the tablecloth off the table and all the stuff on the table just stays in the same place. It's a bit like that's what's happened. So somebody has actually pulled the cloth from under us, but we're all still standing in the same place, and we don't realize how radically the foundation has changed below our feet.
Oh, that's a great picture of it. I think that's exactly a little bit about what's going on right now. And you did a great job of just sort of explaining kind of the American mindset in comparison to the European mindset on these issues as well. We've been talking about the geopolitical landscape, and there are also other variables that are affecting globalization, that affect supply chain and beyond. Issues such as climate, energy, technology. Weigh in on some of those other variables. How is technology, climate, energy affecting the landscape?
And another one, we'll talk about climate and energy and technology, but the great unseen force that's transforming the world is demographics. People are still concerned about population explosion and the pressure that that's putting on the planet. But that is not going to be the problem in the 21st century. The problem in the 21st century is going to be aging populations, stagnating populations, and declining populations. And you can see this happening already in countries like Japan. China's population is already declining. So China, to my mind, China is not going to continue to grow and become ever more powerful as people fear, and overtake the United States as the first superpower. I don't think that's going to happen. And demographics is part of the reason why that isn't going to happen, in my opinion. But even here in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, populations are already in decline. In Western Europe, they're still growing, but mostly because of immigration. Population is growing in the United States, but that's mostly because of immigration as well. How do we have dynamic economies when we have aging populations and declining populations? That's a question that's not answered. That's a pending subject that most developed countries are going to have to face quite soon. So one way of addressing it is through immigration, but immigration, as we know, can be problematic in that some people in certain countries don't like it, or there are real practical problems in terms of integration and so on, and whether it's controlled or uncontrolled or whatever. So demographics is one key issue that we're going to be facing in the future.
As you know, I have a sort of like a biblical perspective and lens on the world. And one of the things that I'm keenly aware of was, God's sort of like announcement at the beginning, basically to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth. And I think that some decisions by some countries to really minimize population and be in fear about not having enough resources, really that the choices that have been made have guaranteed not having enough resources or enough people to do the work to produce the resources. I just find that fascinating. I had wondered a long time ago about China, the one-child policy, and everybody wanted a son. And I said, well, who are these boys going to marry when they grow up? I mean, these are just practical issues. And when I lived in Germany, I could see that there weren't a whole lot of children running around like what you see in the United States. So they're just choices and decisions that we're now starting to see that
Mhm.
fruit kind of like grow up and display itself and present this new problem. Now, what are we going to do?
Yeah, well, even in countries that traditionally had, large families, countries like India, different countries in Africa and Latin America, and a lot of that was to do with people had children to look after them in their old age, really, and with the improvement in health and with the empowerment of women in particular, people choose to have fewer children. And that you can even see that in the birth rates in Africa. So where they were maybe, a woman would have 7 or 8 children in a lifetime, maybe now it's more like 3, which is what we used to have in Europe, and now we have 1 or none. So that's and the issue with that. So whatever the rights and wrongs of it, whether from a religious perspective or a sociological perspective, any other perspective, it's baked in because that's done now. Those children that are not being born today are not going to be here in 20 or 30 years. So we really can't do a whole lot about that right now. In fact, and this kind of goes into politics as well. Some of the policies that encourage people to have more children are more kind of social policies that sometimes the people who would advocate people having a lot of children don't like either. So you've got these tensions back and forth. So that's demographics, and demographics is a shaping force for the world in the future. On the one hand, we'll have that issue that we said, how do we have economies that are dynamic when we have shrinking populations? But on the other hand, if our populations stabilize or actually begin to decline, it may take a bit of pressure off the planet, because we've been talking about climate change. And I think we're in the middle of an energy transformation, and there's lots of arguments about how fast we should go. Should we go faster? Should we go slower? There's a big controversy in the United Kingdom this week because the Prime Minister announced that we're going to go slower on some things. Whether we go faster or slower, or whether the technology is going to be electric or hydrogen or fuel cells or whatever it is, we are in a transition, and I think that is unstoppable. And you can already see it in the way investments are going. So I think for the first time ever this year, the last 12 months, the International Energy Agency published some figures that investment into renewables has overtaken investment into fossil fuels. So we're right in the middle of that. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, but I would say in 5-10 years' time, the energy situation is going to be drastically changed. I mean, even since Russia invaded Ukraine, we've seen a massive transformation in Europe. Countries in Europe, particularly Germany, to an extent Italy, and some of the countries in Eastern Europe were highly dependent on Russian energy. And they have reduced that or eliminated it in literally a year and a half. So Europe is driving hard towards renewables, and not as some sort of kind of wokish fetish, not sort of woke fetish. It's a geopolitical imperative that we have energy independence from rogue countries like Russia and other countries that are quite unsavory as well, the likes of Saudi Arabia or some of the Gulf states or Venezuela, and so those countries that produce fossil fuels. So I think that's going to be a major transformation.
I really do think that we need to slow down a little bit because we have not really built the proper infrastructure for the new sources of energy. And yet many places are clamping down on rules and regulations and what you can and can't do. However, if you want to find a way to charge up your electric, rental vehicle, especially, it may be difficult to do. And so I think that the demand, as far as the laws are concerned, have not kept pace with the reality of the availability of the renewable energy sources. And so that's an issue. That's an ongoing issue.
It's a practical issue. It's a practical challenge. Whenever you have a massive transformation like that, there are going to be discontinuities, and there are going to be people who want to move faster, people who want to move slower. And then there's just a practical lead time of getting things done. There are also big financial and political issues. So, for example, many pension funds may be invested in fossil fuels that, if the transition happens really quickly, become worthless. So, those investments, where will they go? There are countries whose national wealth is built on reserves of fossil fuels. What happens if they have to stay in the ground and become worthless? So there are political tensions around this as well. So it's not easy, and there are going to be tensions and probably clashes, maybe even wars over the energy transition, as certain countries lose both political clout and financial clout as that transition happens. And also that will happen at a corporate level as well, which is, I guess, why we see many of the fossil fuel companies looking to be the ones who pioneered the renewables transition.
Absolutely. So with that in mind, just that whole notion that this is a multifaceted issue that we're talking about, this whole globalization, regionalization, and so on. How are you advising your best clients right now in this climate? What are you suggesting to them so far as getting prepared, being prepared, or what to pay attention to and what to do? Something that maybe you haven't mentioned just yet.
I think they need to take a strategic approach and have explicit programs in place where they're looking at their supply chains, but not just at the first tier. So it's challenging enough to look at, where am I getting supplies from? Who are my suppliers? And in which plants are they producing these different things that I get from them? Often companies don't have visibility of that. So they know they have a supplier, and they know the supplier maybe has 5 or 6 plants around the world. But do they know this filter that I'm using in this machine, which of the plants is that coming from? Is it coming from the plant in India? Is it coming from the plant in Brazil? Where is it coming from? They don't know that. And then they don't know the second and the third tiers behind their own suppliers, people who are making products that they are using, but are sourcing their own materials from some other place. And that is largely invisible. And there's a statistic. So there's a supply chain risk management software company called Resilink, who are experts in this field and have software that helps companies track and monitor the supply chains. And they say that 85% of supply chain interruptions come from those hidden tiers, not from the first tier. And then we also have all the logistics service providers who are working in between those nodes. So those factories of our suppliers and our factories and our distribution centers, there are many, many logistics service providers working in the spaces, moving the product or storing the product, distributing the product, and so on. So that's very, very complex. And as I said at the very beginning, it's not so much a supply chain as a kind of a complex web and network. So companies, I think what I'm advising them to do is to really start to map that and to have explicit programs where they're able to determine what the risk profile is, where it's greater, where it's lesser, and put in place contingent and preventive actions so that if a risk materializes, that they're ready with plans to go. It's a big undertaking. It's going to take some investment, and it's a little bit like, you purchase insurance and people think, well, I have this expense, but how do I understand the return on that investment if nothing ever happens? So no doubt it's going to be a challenge for the risk management teams to argue for the resources and argue that there is a return on investment for having those resources allocated to them. But I think if companies look back at some of the events that have happened, so for example, Fukushima, if they look at maybe the volcanoes in Iceland that interrupted particularly the auto industry, if they look at the blockage in the Suez Canal, if they look at what happened during COVID, some of the costs of being behind the curve when those things happened were massive. And you have to think, if something else happens, and the likelihood is that something else will happen because of all the things we've been talking about, because of geopolitical fragmentation, because of climate change, and because of demographic issues and immigration and so on. All of those factors giving us a world where the likelihood and the frequency of these kinds of interruptions are ever more frequent. So I think the return on investment will be there if it's done judiciously and if it's done strategically. And that's what I'm advising clients.
I love that because you're inviting people to become more knowledgeable about how things work and to understand it in a strategic way. It's not enough just to know who your near partner is. You have to know who their partners are, where things are coming from to better understand what the vulnerabilities could be. So when you think about flexibility, when you think about redundancy, and you think about other aspects like that in today's world, security and all those kinds of issues, how else would you advise your clients to be prepared for this current context and for the future context?
Well, I think it's almost a change in values or a change in settings. We've always been kind of obsessed with efficiency. Obviously, we shouldn't let efficiency go, but we need to temper our drive towards efficiency with a consideration for security and continuity of supply, which is why we're seeing a lot of these business continuity programs in businesses. And that means maybe investing more in certain things. So certain inventories, we might need to have strategic inventories in friendly locations that we can access in emergency. It might mean investing in redundancy, for example, in qualifying several suppliers. So the qualification process for suppliers, say, for example, in pharmaceuticals, can be quite onerous, and companies say, well, we don't really want to go through that again, but, to go through that and to invest in that. And I think because they're going to be investing more in certain capabilities to hedge against these kinds of events, they're going to be looking for efficiencies elsewhere. And those efficiencies elsewhere, I think, are driving a lot more interest in automation. So I'm seeing a lot of interest in automation in the logistics sector, which is a sector I spend a lot of time in, but also in manufacturing. And we have automation of physical process, but also automation of procedural processes as well. And I did an interview recently of a company that specializes in decision intelligence software. And this is where they're using AI to aid the taking of multiple decisions in the supply chain, and in some cases to actually automate those decisions. So I think the technology transformation is going to facilitate a lot of this efficiency that we need to offset the investments we have to make in the contingency and preventive actions, and also to offset some of the challenges we face in demographics. Because particularly in factory scenarios and warehouse scenarios, they're finding it very difficult to get people to come to work in them. And therefore, automation and AI and technology is going to help there, notwithstanding the fact that some people are afraid that AI is going to replace us. But we have these paradoxes and these contradictory or opposing tensions going on at the same time. But that's the world we live in, and that's the world we have to deal with.
Absolutely, it is. And so I know you have a lot of expertise in this area and in this information, and you have resources that people can access. You have a book, you have a podcast. Tell us about the resources that you have available and that others can participate in.
Yeah, so I have a podcast, which is called Interlinks. And Interlinks is an interview-based podcast of 25, 30-minute episodes. Very international in orientation. So you'll find it on Acast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other platforms, called Interlinks. And it has a very international flavor, and lots of the interviewees are from all over the world. I also have a video series, which I call For the Week That's In It, which is kind of 2 to 3 minute quick videos. And I pick a topic that's hot in the week and talk about it and try to put it into some sort of strategic perspective for business people. Again, a lot of that is internationally focused. And then I have my newsletter on LinkedIn called The Strategic Context. And in fact, those three things, probably the easiest way to pick them up is basically to connect with me on LinkedIn, because although they go out on YouTube and Acast and so on, I put them all out through LinkedIn as well. So that's probably the easiest way. And then my book is called International Supply Chain Relationships, and you'll find that on Amazon. And in that, I'm talking about how important relationships are to supply chains. Because as we said at the beginning, going back to the Ford Motor Company, they exercise control through ownership. And nowadays in supply chains, we exercise control through the quality of our relationships with our supply chain partners. And that's really the theme that runs through the book, to take a kind of a sophisticated and international perspective on supply chain relationships.
Thank you so much for sharing those resources for those who would like to hear more of your wisdom and expertise on this subject. And I have accessed a number of those resources and tools and know them to be very valuable. And that's why you're on the show today, because I really appreciate the perspective and the worldview that you have on the topic that we were speaking about. So, Patrick, what would you say are your additional words of wisdom that you would like to leave for my community of corporate executives? Maybe something that's a wrap-up statement or that you haven't said yet that these executives need to be thinking about.
Well, I say to them, the international order is changing rapidly. We're in a new world. Pay close attention to what's going on, in a way that maybe you haven't done before, because there are lots of new threats out there, but there are also lots of new opportunities out there. So you have to be aware to be able to take advantage of those. So that would be my key advice to business executives. And I'd also say, even if you're not trading internationally, your suppliers are probably working internationally. So look at your business in the round, in a holistic way, and make sure that you have a good understanding of the international context.
Thank you, Patrick. I love the way you said that you're becoming more informed, both to mitigate risk and also to take advantage of opportunities. It's not either or. It's not, just one side and not the other side. It's a both and, which makes me think it's probably not so much life after globalization. Maybe it's more like life in the midst of globalization. And as you said, it's just changing and showing up in a different way.
Exactly. It's a new type of globalization. There will be huge opportunities. There'll be great wins, particularly for companies located in the developed economies that may be lost out to offshoring, who will benefit now from nearshoring and reshoring. So, this is not all negative. There's a lot of positivity in here as well.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Patrick, for being my guest today. I appreciate you being here and everything that you shared with us. And we're going to close down today with a Bible verse that comes from Luke, the 14th chapter, verses 28 through 29. And this is Jesus speaking. And he says, "But which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it, lest after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.'" I think that's so relevant to the conversation we've been having today. And Patrick has shared a number of ways to begin to become educated and to count the cost about the current environment and the current climate of business. And so I hope that those of you who are listening today will take heed and that you will pay attention to these new dynamics, understand what's going on, and make wise decisions for your business, your corporation, with the global geopolitical landscape in mind, automation, the energy issues, and everything else that we've talked about. It takes planning and counting the cost. Hi, this is Dr. Karen, and I'm here today with Jos Snoep, who is the CEO and president of the Bible League. And the Bible League is a ministry that provides Bibles and instructional materials in the Word of God, as well as trains teachers in their local language and culture to share the Word of God and to disciple people. So today, Yost, tell us a little bit about the impact of the Bible League. What's going on out there?
Last year, I met this lady. Her name was Nimia. Nimia was born in 49. She became a Christian in 2002. And last year, we were able to invite her in one of our trainings. At the end of that meeting, she stood up and shared her testimony. She said, "This is the first time I received a Bible for my own, and I'm equipped to share the Word of God with others." I thought by myself at that point, that's why we are Bible League. That's why God called us to be in ministry, to serve people like that and to equip them with the right materials and with the Word of God.
Oh, thank you so much, Yost, for sharing that story. And what I want to let everyone know is you can be a part of this movement as well. You can go to BibleLeague.org to find out more about the ministry and also to donate to the ministry. There are lots more stories like the one that Yost just shared today about lives that are changed and impacted for God through Jesus Christ. You've been listening to The Voice of Leadership with me, Dr. Karen Wilson Starks. And I want to give a special thanks to jazz saxophonist Ron McMillan for granting us permission to use his gifted music on our show. Thanks for listening, and remember to go to my website, transleadership.com, for more strategies, insights, and leadership resources.